All right, our second topic this week, we're looking at consciousness and some recent publications and recent over in the past, let's say 5 to 10 years, and just further development of the idea that consciousness, which is something, we look at human consciousness and we understand that to be like our awareness of ourselves internally, externally, and our ability to contemplate these things, so to speak, contemplate our existence and so forth. Whether that in our brains, it may be a byproduct of entropy, which is, from a physics standpoint, the tendency of systems to move from order to disorder. So that happening in our brain and consciousness is like a byproduct of that. From what we know, this is still stuff that we're still being developed because you can't get into animals' heads. But consciousness is something that, at least to the extent that we have it, is a human phenomenon. Now, you can get into primates and so forth and question whether or not they have it to some degree, or other animals. And, there are far out theories that everything has consciousness and so forth, even inanimate objects. So, but we're not going to get into all that. Just, I know, Tunde, you look at, and we've had conversations, from a scientific standpoint, just on entropy and systems and so forth. And so I thought this one, this was something I sent to you and just like, hey, what was your reaction? So what was your kind of initial takeaway on this concept of consciousness being a byproduct of entropy, in our brains?
Yeah.
And
I just think that's a fascinating kind of way to look at it, and let's say hypothesis, right? So that someone throws out there, because I know that from when we did our show on the James Webb Telescope, I remember that that telescope is so advanced, it's starting to make certain observations, like that. There's some theories now that time might be basically like much different than we perceive, that everything is actually happening all at once, the past, the future, and this idea of infinite versions of yourself and all that, and that our view of time, what they call the arrow of time, that time only goes one direction, is our brain's way of basically making sense of that.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of, to me, melds with this entropy idea, and that basically entropy and time are somewhat related, because without the fact of entropy, you couldn't have time. And I guess without time, entropy wouldn't be able to display itself. So
the arrow of time going, because that's the entropy implies a progression. You're going from point A, where there's order, to point B, where there's less order, to point C, where there's less order, and so forth. So that implies that linear time nature.
Yeah, and I think, the article does a good example of, I think, just for the audience here, explaining entropy from that idea of a low entropy state. They said, like if you broke an egg open and put it in a bowl, everything, that's low entropy, because you've got the yolk there, you've got the white there, you've got the shell in your hand, But once you scramble that egg up, that's high entropy. That's a lot of disorder. And the reality is, and that's why I like the scrambled egg example, because once you scramble an egg, you can't unscramble it. And so that's the idea of the arrow of time. You can't undo that entropy once you go from a low entropy state to a high entropy state. And so the idea is that, the study they did, and that's why they did a good job in the article acknowledging that their sample size was only 9 people, and that, this is
there were
the beginning of an idea. Yeah, but they're not trying to say that this is absolute fact. It requires a lot more study. But the idea, I guess, they studied people like from when they were sleeping to when they were awake, certain thing, and the way that the brain reacts. When we're awake, we're in a much higher entropy state than when we're asleep. And when you're asleep, you're not really contemplating time the same way you are when you're awake. So, I thought it was very interesting.
And if you think of a dream state, also time doesn't work in the same way that it does when we're awake and conscious. And asleep is kind of unconscious in that sense. That's the way it's termed. To me, the first thing I think you got to really to look at here is the acknowledgement, which people are aware of, but you just don't think about that often, is that we don't know where consciousness comes from. Like this is hey, here's an idea. Let's test this. This is, scientific method and so forth in terms of trying to understand and get more information on that question. And this is I think that the allusion to the James Webb's telescope and our discussion on that not too long ago is a good one, in the sense that what we talk about there, and I think the same applies here, is that as the ability and the capability of measuring improves, then our understanding of things evolves. That's kind of the necessary implication of science, as long as our society and our culture is set up in a way to be able to receive and incorporate new information. Sometimes, you have societies and cultures that new information is not welcome. And so that stuff is pushed out, and people get killed if they challenge the status quo with better measurement and so forth. So that's our society allows for dynamicism in that sense, that it's okay, well, we have better measurement. So the idea that they're measuring the states of entropy in your brain is better measurement. Now, if you look at the idea that entropy is how our brains will generate consciousness, I think that it makes a lot of sense, in the sense that the state of disorder that things will progress towards will affect the ability, how our brain processes what's around us. And what we know is, all of our senses and so forth are pulling in all this information, and then our brains try to make order of that. We try what our bodies, our brains naturally try to create. When we see stars, we see constellations and so forth. And so, your allusion to the universe being as well, like, when our body, when our senses are pulling in all this information, and then our brains are then taking that information and saying, okay, let's create a some type of ordered system. Again, constellations, seeing things in clouds, or just a forest or whatever. Then how time progresses and how we experience that is that eventual disorder. Another analogy I'll have, and then I'll kick it back to you, would be culture as well. Like, cultures tend to, and then this would be collections of conscious individuals, tends to progress from a state of order to a state of disorder, and then a reorganization into a new order, and then that progressively deteriorates and so forth. So I think that just the idea that our observation and how we're perceiving things and how these things are organized is something that is subject to the concept of entropy, which is a physics thing, is a good direction that they should continue going down, basically, is kind of my takeaway. Like, yeah, tell me more, try to study this more, because obviously from, the limitations of the study, this isn't definitive, but it's an interesting thought process and an interesting kind of hole to keep digging and saying, hey, let's keep digging in here and seeing what we see, because this may come into play and interplay with a lot more things than we think.
Yeah, and that's a great point you make about, like societies, the rise and fall of empires. One could say, the star exploding, the supernova, right? That creates a whole new set of things in the galaxy. So, it's really a fascinating way to perceive how, or think about how our brains and how we evolved. Like, you're talking about consciousness, and you're right. I mean, I'm trying to think and define consciousness, and I can't. And it goes back to, we did a show, now this was a couple of years ago, about how humans have equated either our mind or our body, how it works based on whatever the main technology is at that time. So there was a time thousands of years ago that people thought of the internal workings of the body as like a flowing water or river, because a lot of the technology at that time was hydro related, like dams and all that kind of stuff. And today we think of the human brain and how our bodies work more like a machine or a computer. And, these kind of conversations just are a good reminder that we are so complex. I don't think we are even near having a computer or AI become like we are, just because of things like that. I mean, think about what we're saying. If we're even near going in the direction of what this stuff really is, the idea that time is actually not linear and not going forward at all times like an arrow, that everything is already there, future and past, but our feeling of time is a result of how our brains deal with being in this universe. That's so complex. I can't even go past fathoming just that. So, It's just, to me, it's just all fascinating.
There's an inherent limitation because, and this is quoting Emerson Pugh.
We're living in it.
Well, but
it's
also
hard to observe something you're inside.
That's an excellent point. It's hard to get perspective of the storm when you're in the middle of it, but also just our hardware, like Emerson Pugh, the famous quote, if the human brain were so simple that we could understand it, we would be so simple that we couldn't. And so we're trying to, with the machinery that we have, we're trying to then understand how that machinery works. And so there's an inherent limiting principle there. Now, as we continue to, again, this is where we go into tools of measurement and how that's so important with science. When we get to the tools of measurement, and then that might be in moving forward, that might be AI being able to analyze us and so forth. But as our tools of management get better, we're going to be in a situation where we can get a better understanding of this in the future, more than what we would be able to grasp just with our existing hardware, with our brains and our own consciousness. So there's possibility of learning more, like more so than there has been in the past. We'll see where that goes, but this is an interesting direction.
Yeah, but ignorance is bliss, so I'll be fine. Just
well, that's the other question: is does knowing more make things better or happier? And the answer is not always yes. So we have to worry about that as well. So, but no, I think we can wrap from there. We appreciate everybody for joining us on this episode of Call Like I See It. Subscribe to the podcast, rate it, review it, tell us what you think, send it to a friend. Until next time, I'm James Keys.
I'm Tunde Ogunlana.
All right, we'll talk to you next time.